Good evening. My name is Carl Blake. This is the oral presentation for PADM 781, Intergovernmental Management, for my final term paper. The topic of my term paper is the Medicaid expansion, which was one of the three key principles included in the enactment of the Patient Protection and Affordable Care Act, also known as the ACA, which was signed into law in 2010. The other key issues that were included in the ACA were the individual mandate and the insurance exchanges. My research analyzes principally the central question of, is the Medicaid expansion a clear example of coercive federalism? The concept of coercive federalism, as I review it for the purposes of this paper, are based on the writings of John Kincaid, who we studied or read earlier this year as part of Module 2. The biggest challenge in analyzing my question is discovering fairly early on in my research that the central question has, I guess, seemingly been resolved by the Supreme Court decision in 2012. But before I really came to that discovery in my research, I had posed the question of whether the Medicaid expansion is not purely coercive federalism, but whether it also reflects the concept of one-tailed devolution, which was described by Conlon and Posner in one of the readings that we had as part of Module 3 earlier this year. I also wanted to try to demonstrate that perhaps the Medicaid expansion is not coercive federalism at all. This is based on the historical nature of the Medicaid program that I would say better reflects a collaborative relationship that has existed between the federal government, which is charged with outlining the parameters for the program, and states that are charged with implementation. I think it's important to point out that the Medicaid program, by and large, has been a contentious program and a contentious relationship that has existed between the federal government and the states, and yet most states still participate in the Medicaid program, although there's been political debate about the funding aspects of it and some of that type of thing. I'm also reviewing whether this is more than coercive federalism based on clear signs of collaboration that occurred during the debate, which most people don't really realize because I think the political contention around the discussion about the ACA was so hyper partisan that we don't really realize that there was a lot of open-ended debate on this particular program and this expansion that was more reflective of collaboration between, at the time, what would have been Republicans and Democrats in Congress, and then what would ultimately have been designed as the federal and state governments. Finally, I tried to do a legal analysis of the expansion from not just the Supreme Court level, but also from the lower courts that reviewed this from a number of different angles. Again, the challenge for my research was that ultimately, I guess, the Supreme Court has decided this question of coercion, but I think there's more to it, and that's why my hypothesis essentially is that the Medicaid expansion is not purely coercive federalism, but that it is also reflective of one-tailed devolution and a collaborative relationship that exists. My research for the Medicaid expansion approaches this from four angles. The first part of my research is to evaluate the central question about coercive federalism. Again, this is based on the work of Kincaid, also of the work that was supplemented by Rosenbaum and Westmoreland that really digs deep into the question of coercion and the Medicaid expansion. Another author that I came across in my research was a gentleman named Christopher Pline, who also evaluated the question. The second part of my research focuses on evaluating one-tailed devolution, seemingly as an offset to the coercive nature of the law. Conlon and Posner have written a couple of articles on this subject, on one-tailed devolution. One of them, as I mentioned earlier, was an article that we read during Module 3, and they look at not only the ACA, but a number of other aspects during the Obama administration where one-tailed devolution came into play. And I think that's an important thing to consider in reviewing whether or not the Medicaid expansion is actually coercive federalism. The third approach that I take to this analysis is whether or not it's actually coercive federalism at all in the Medicaid expansion. I think there's enough evidence to suggest that it is more of a collaborative intergovernmental relationship. This again is based on some of the writings of Rosenbaum and Westmoreland, as well as Dinan and Hayter and Weimer. In order to consider whether or not this is actually something collaborative and not coercive, I think it's important to review the state involvement in the debate during the policy development, as well as the widely varying political opinions that were expressed throughout the debate. I think what occurred during the course of the debate is often lost by the fact that politics sort of trumped what ultimately dictated the outcome of this legislation. But there's enough writing, I believe, that suggests that the Medicaid expansion is reflective of an intention for a collaborative relationship. And I think the one-tailed devolution aspect, which I mentioned previously, also comes into play. I think it's also important to consider that some of the states, including Republican-leaning states, had already affected expansion, much like what was envisioned in the Medicaid expansion in the ACA. And I don't think that fact can be minimized in light of the debate around it and the expected implementation process for it. And then, as I mentioned earlier, I reviewed the appeals court findings before it ever got to the Supreme Court level, where at every point until it reached the Supreme Court, lower level courts, with I think one exception, had determined that this was not actually coercive federalism. And so that leads me really to the fourth part of my analysis, which is the Supreme Court ruling itself. As I said, it seems that the Supreme Court may have settled the question because they affirmed that there is what is termed the coercive doctrine, which is based on the work of Gamcar and Pickerel. But I also reviewed the state's lawsuits against law, the most notable of which was the National Federation of Independent Businesses versus Kathleen Sebelius, who was the Secretary of HHS at the time. Again, the Supreme Court, I think, answers my central question, but I think my hypothesis still holds in that maybe this is not purely coercive federalism. Ultimately, my conclusion is challenged by the fact that the Supreme Court has made the ruling that it has. But I think the debate process, how implementation was planned, and ultimately, even after the Supreme Court ruled on the question of coercion, there's still been a great amount of interest in expansion among a number of states, including Republican-leaning states, that looks something more like collaborative federalism and a collaborative intergovernmental relationship. In fact, I came across a letter from the National Governors Association to Secretary Sebelius at the time that was meant to express the view that the states were still interested in the expansion, even following the Supreme Court's decision. And then I leave my paper really with a sort of a question or a challenge, and that is whether or not the hyper-partisan nature of our politics during the debate process and the implementation and even where we stand today, whether that really maybe dictated the notion of coercive federalism more than whether it actually was coercive federalism. I posed the question at the very end of my research of would coercive federalism have been considered if there had been a different political environment? I think that's a tough question to answer, but I think that's something that can't be overlooked as this program was evaluated in the legal level, the debate around it, both in the public and in Congress, and ultimately what was enacted into law and has since changed with the court ruling. So it's been a very challenging topic. I didn't really know much about it. I think the Supreme Court issue was the thing that tripped me up the most. But I think the role that the states played in the process, the role that both political parties played in the process, is not as divided as what has been portrayed, at least from the readings. So I hope that gives you some insight into what I've considered, and I look forward to your feedback. Thank you.